Hi guys. So today I'm going to go over what are some alternatives to the curly girl method. Before I jump into that, I kind of have to go over what I mean by the curly girl method because while most people watching this video probably feel like I already know what the curly girl method is, it's kind of confusing because when you get really into these communities and when you read the book, um, it's actually not always defined the same way. The true curly girl method comes from the book, the Curly Girl Method Handbook by Lorraine Massey. I know that there's claims that the techniques that she listed in there are not original to her, that she stole them from other people, specifically some people in the black community. Unfortunately, I don't know the sources of who these ideas really belong to, but I know that the Curly Girl Handbook kind of took off, and that's why most of us use the phrase Curly Girl Method is based on her book. So, for the sake of this video, I'm going to refer to her book as what the true Curly Girl Method is. Even when you're relying on the Curly Girl Method Handbook as the true source of the Curly Girl Method, it doesn't necessarily always agree with what you'll see called the Curly Girl Method online. I do think that there is kind of some really basic understandings of what Curly Girl Method means, usually. Usually, when people say that they're following the Curly Girl Method, what they mean is that they are either using a co-wash or a gentle shampoo that is free from sulfates as kind of their normal cleanser. And then their conditioner, their gel, any of their other products that they're putting on their hair are going to be free from silicones, free from waxes that can cause a lot of buildup, and free from drying alcohols. In a nutshell, that's what kind of the absolute basic of the core Curly Girl Method is, that as most people understand it online, as far as I can tell. I had followed Curly Girl Method like YouTubers and the curly hair subreddit, and I read like the naturally curly forums for probably 2 or 3 years before I actually bought the Curly Girl Handbook. And I bought it on thrift books because I'm cheap and it was like $5 shipped. Um, and so it was a slightly older book, and I know that there have been some updates to it. So maybe like the old version or the newest version are slightly different than the one I read. I'm not entirely sure. But there are definitely some differences in what is in the Curly Girl Handbook versus what I thought I understood the Curly Girl Method to be based on what I was reading online. The Curly Girl Method Handbook that I own has 13 pages that talk about what to use on your hair or products. And by 13 pages, I mean like that's counting each side. So like a two-sided page would be 2 pages. So there really isn't very much in the book that talks about like the do's and don'ts of hair products. And of those 13 pages, only 2 of them talk about what ingredients to look for in store-bought products. The remaining 11 pages are recipes for things that you can make at home, like hair masks or how to refresh your hair using essential oils. And those recipes use natural ingredients, mostly food-based things like eggs, avocado, things like that. Something that really surprised me about reading the actual Curly Girl Method handbook is that I had always thought that basically when it came to conditioners, you just have to avoid silicones, drying alcohols, and waxes. In the book, they do reference those things, but it repeatedly uses the phrase botanical conditioner, and it repeatedly talks about using plant-based ingredients. So it advocates for looking for hair products that have high concentrations of things like rosemary or mint. And I have never come across any post, I don't think ever, in any of the wavy curly hair groups that I'm part of, or any of the forums or on Reddit, where people are talking about botanical conditioners or making sure that you have plant-based ingredients in your hair products. Most of us talk about things like LA Looks Gel or Aussie Instant Freeze and other like affordable. Seems like for the most part the online concept of Curly Girl Method has kind of just swept that part aside. There are also confusion online versus in the book about what is and isn't allowed. Like what does the Curly Girl Method truly ban, right? So it really does ban using blow dryers, curling irons, or straightening irons. It says that using a hair dryer even once can damage your hair and your curl pattern. It also does advocate for strictly finger detangling your hair. So brushes, combs are not permitted. Sometimes people think that you can't diffuse at all on the curly girl method, or that you can only diffuse on cool heat. But in the wave section of the Curly Girl Handbook, I'm trying to find it, it actually recommends diffusing. But it does say to do so on low or medium, not high heat. Here is what the Curly Girl method has to say about clarifying shampoos. Let me clarify one thing. I have no faith in shampoos, and those that say clarifying terrify me even more. These products are often harsher on hair than regular shampoos, stripping it of hydration. Don't waste your money on one of the more cleverly packaged products that will probably damage your hair and make your curls look worse. Okay, so now that all of that is finally out of the way, what are alternatives to the Curly Girl method? The fact that a lot of people online will say that they're using the Curly Girl method when they're kind of tweaking it a little bit and it's still mostly Curly Girl method is kind of an example of how that's something you can do. You can kind of mostly follow the Curly Girl method. You can avoid sulfates and silicones, or you could even do some of the other things like look for botanical based ingredients, but you can kind of break other rules if it suits you. Some people call this the modified Curly Girl method. Lorraine Massey on social media has been really outspoken about how she really dislikes people using the phrase modified Curly Girl method. She says you either strictly follow the Curly Girl method or you don't. There is no such thing as modified Curly Girl method. But regardless, there are some ways of breaking Curly Girl method rules that seem to be more common than others. So some of the ways that I see a lot of people kind of breaking Curly Girl method rules despite mostly following the Curly Girl method would be clarifying their hair occasionally. Most people do at least once a month. There are some sulfate-free clarifying shampoos, but most people will clarify using a sulfate shampoo. Another way that I frequently see people mostly follow the Curly Girl method but slightly break it is when it comes to detangling. A lot of people really struggle with tangles and just feel like finger detangling is not either just not realistic, period, or that it just isn't reasonable within like the amount of time that they can devote to their hair. I've seen people say things like, it would take me a full hour if I wanted to finger detangle my hair. Yes, I could do it, but am I willing to devote that much time just to avoid using a wide tooth comb or something? So that's another really common one. A third way that people commonly modify the Curly Girl method is by using high heat while diffusing. Another alternative to the Curly Girl method is the Wavy Girl method. According to Christine, the Wavy Girl method is not a specific routine. It's not a specific list of do's and don'ts or cans and cannots. It's more about this belief system that hair is really varied and what works for some people isn't going to work for other people, and that what works for wavy hair is often different than what works for like type 3 curly hair. It's a belief system that basically you should do what works for you. So I guess in a way it's almost like an anti-method, I guess. If you're doing your own thing and you have wavy hair, you can call it the Wavy Girl method and you're almost certainly gonna fit the definition because it's doing whatever you want. And that's another alternative to the Curly Girl method, is just doing whatever you want. It feels like sometimes people get really hung up in doing things right and kind of following the advice of other people that they kind of forget that we can all do whatever we want. You can go to the store and buy whatever you want regardless of what the ingredients are. You don't necessarily have to even know what the ingredients are. You can just experiment on your own hair and see what works for you. Honestly, sometimes when I see people who knew that they had wavy hair to begin with and they used to have a routine that they were really happy with, and then they try switching to Curly Girl method approved products and they don't work well for them, and then they're seeking help, I'm kind of like, why don't you just do what you were doing before if it was working for you? Like, who cares if it's not Curly Girl approved if it works for you? So obviously depending on what you do and depending on your hair, what you try may or may not work. So I'm not trying to say that there's no validity in trying to do gentle or more natural things like avoiding heat and maybe even in certain ingredients. Honestly, I'm really sketchy on that. I'm not sure the science is there. But regardless, you can do what you want and you can learn from your own hair and try to like listen to your own hair. I remember being really confused by that when I was really new to the curly girl method, that people would say things like they can feel when their hair has too much protein, or they can feel when their hair needs to be clarified or when it needs moisture. Because I felt like my hair feels the same all the time. I have no idea what you guys are talking about. And over time, I have gained a lot of those abilities just by like paying really close attention to my hair and how it acts and how it looks and how it feels. There are differences in your hair. You just have to kind of like start really paying close attention, and you'll likely notice them over time and be able to learn from your own hair and your own like hair experiments. There are even some ways that are like kind of widely frowned upon that some people do and get good results from. One of the big things that's advocated for with the curly girl method and with, you know, just being gentle on your hair is that you should stop using heat and that you should stop dyeing or bleaching your hair. Which, interestingly, the curly girl method book that I have says that you can dye your hair, that you just have to use gentle methods. I don't know. There are people who dye or bleach their hair, especially if it's wavy, and they do it on purpose to try to make their hair a little bit damaged or a little bit more porous, a little more high porosity. Because if you have really fine waves or really low porosity waves, really silky hair, a lot of times it just doesn't hold texture well. Even though it has natural texture, it just will fall flat really easily, or it really needs a ton of support from hard hold products in order to hold itself. But then if you kind of like rough it up a little with a little bit of bleach damage, a little bit of heat damage, sometimes people will find that then their waves hold themselves without needing those hard hold products all the time, because having like a little bit of like texture or grit to their hair helps it stay in their clumps instead of like being so silky that it just falls apart. If you're looking to completely ditch the curly girl method and would like somebody to kind of help inspire you and like just have confidence that it's okay, I would recommend following Mains by Mel. She has like type 3 curly hair, so some of what works for her, maybe a lot of what works for her, isn't going to work for wavy hair necessarily. She's a textured hair specialist, and she doesn't believe in the curly girl method. She has some videos talking about the science or the lack thereof. Also, she just has like gorgeous curly hair, and she talks about how she's used silicones basically her whole life, and just it's just fine. She has some great videos that are worth checking out. If you don't strictly follow the curly girl method, leave me a comment and let me know what aspects of the curly girl method you break. I'd be curious to see your answers. Bye. And that's really... Did you just laugh at me? Oh.